There were some that were past tense, but you know, this is such an interesting topic. If you study it carefully, you find out that on the cross, Jesus reached backwards, clear back to Adam, and he reached forwards to the inconceivable end of time, and he got all the sins. He gathered them all up, and he paid for all of them. He paid the whole thing with his suffering, with his death. But that's one result. He put us in right standing with God by taking away the offenses, taking away even the charges and accusations, Paul says. He took them away, nailed them to his... And he's so satisfied the righteous demands of a righteous judge that God could now say, those are all paid for, case closed, let's fold that up, put those accusations and charges away. And whoever believes in Jesus, whoever is trusting in him, you can come right... You see, Paul says that we can stand in the presence of God without charges or accusations. That's the way he says it. Now that's one thing. But what about the devil? What about the enemy? What about the devils running around down here? You know, again, if you study all the different scriptures I have to bear on this, you get the idea that, you know, in the Old Testament, you read about Job, for instance, and talks about the sons of God came up to present themselves before the Lord. And Satan was there. And he came and presented himself before God. You know, and he brings all these charges and accusations against Job and gets into this kind of discussion with God. And a lot of people read that and think, well, that's just what's going on with my life. No, it isn't what's going on with your life. Because Jesus said, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. And whether he was speaking prophetically, which I think he was, of the cross, at any rate, Satan has been thrown down from that place. He said he's lost that position. He's been thrown down to the earth, the book of Revelation says. Now, you know, I don't want to get into whether everything is past or future or present or whatever, but he's not up there talking in God's ear. He's down here talking in your ear. That's the point. He's running around down here, our enemy. That's why Paul said, you know, to the Romans, these divisions in the church, mark those people that are causing trouble in the church and just avoid them. I think that's kind of nice, because the God of peace, who works by peace, he'll bruise Satan under your feet shortly. In other words, you've got an enemy, all right, and he causes you trouble, and he causes you problems. But you know what? Think about the God of peace and put your trust in him, and he'll just take care of that guy for you. And see, here Jesus is saying, he's calling our attention to the fact, or the writer of the Hebrews is saying that Jesus, in his death, one thing is he put us in right relationship with God, but the other thing is, it says, concerning the devil, it says, through his death, he destroyed him. That means katargeo. He took away his power. He deprived him of power. He took away his power. Now, we're here in Hebrews. Turn over to chapter 10 just for a second. I like this idea of about under our feet, and I want to show you something here. So the thing we get from chapter 2 is Satan's been deprived of power, and we're supposed to see Jesus, focus our attention on him. Now notice, I want to get some more thoughts on this and make it a little more plain for us. Here in chapter 10 of Hebrews, we're talking about the once-for-all sacrifice of Jesus, and it's a very beautiful passage, especially the first 20, 21 verses or so. But I don't want to take time to read the whole thing today, though it's really good, and I commend it to you to read. But let's just skip down to here where it talks about the sacrifice of Jesus in verse 12. Speaking of Christ, it said, but this man, meaning Jesus, after he had offered one sacrifice for sins, one was all it took, by the way, one sacrifice for sins forever, meaning once for all, forever, for all of them. What did he do? After he offered that sacrifice, it said, then he sat down at the right hand of God. Why is he sitting at the right hand of God? Verse 13. From henceforth, expecting, till his enemies be made his footstool. Or in other words, till his enemies be brought unto his feet. Now it says, after he offered this sacrifice for sins, and we're told that by that sacrifice for sins, he destroyed or deprived of power Satan. Isn't that right? Didn't we just read that a minute ago? It says after he did that, he sat down. Now, I would just attract your thinking to the fact, why did he sit down? What is it in this passage? This verse appears many times in the New Testament. It said he sat down. Why did he sit down? Is he so tired? He said, man, I got to take a break. No, give me a glass of lemonade, you angel. I'm tired. No, it's not like that. He sat down because the work was finished. No more work to do. The work is, he counts it done. As far as he's concerned, that's a finished work. In fact, he said that on the cross. It is finished. And it says after that, all that redemptive work was done, when he sacrificed himself, gave his life for sins, it says now he He sat down at the right hand of God. Seated because the work is finished. Seated implies a ruler. A ruler sits down. You know, when people present themselves before a king, they come in and they're standing and then they might kneel. Sometimes they prostrate themselves, but the king is the one sitting on a chair. He's seated. Seating implies rest, for one thing. You don't have to get up and do anything. See, the king sits there and he doesn't have to jump up and run around and do it. He rules from that position of that seated position. So it says Jesus, he sat down at the right hand of God. And then notice verse 13. From that position, that seated position, it says, from henceforth expecting. Now, think about what expecting means. It means something's going to happen and you're expecting. And you're just sitting there patiently expecting it to happen. You have reason to expect. So he's expecting, what is he expecting? His enemies to be made his footstool. Or under his feet, in other words. Like Paul said, shortly. See, that's a lot like this expecting, isn't it? God of peace will shortly bruise Satan under your feet. Well, here we read the same thing about Jesus. And we're told that Jesus is seated at the right hand of God. And he's just sitting there patiently expecting until his enemies be brought under his feet. Now that tells me one thing, that he's got enemies. And I guess you could say Satan is behind all of that, at the core. But there are some things that are not necessarily in line with his will or with his rule or with how things ought to be. But what is he doing about it? Well, it says, if I read this right, he's just sitting there expecting until they come into alignment. Now there's another passage that says very much the same thing, and I'd like to read that to you also. It's in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And we sometimes, when we talk about the end of the world or end times things, we get very complicated scenarios, but I want to give you a very simple one. And not to say anything about all the complicated ones, but I just want to give you a simple one here. This is in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 24. This is the shorthand version. This is the Reader's Digest version. This is the short version of it, leaving out lots of other possible details. But just notice the core elements here. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 24. Then cometh the end. That's why I say this has to do with the end. Whatever he means by that, that's what he says. Then cometh the end. And what does it mean for Paul here? Comma, when he, meaning Jesus, when he shall have delivered up the kingdom. Not established, but delivered it up. In other words, it's finished now. When he shall have delivered up the kingdom to God, even the Father. Listen. When he shall have put down all rule and authority and power, that means all contrary, anything contrary to him. Verse 25 says, for he must reign until he hath put all enemies under his feet. Now we read in Hebrews that he's seated at the right hand of God, expecting till all of his enemies be put under his feet. Now by reading this passage, this is what I said about reading passages that say similar things, we get a little different wording. We see here that it says he must reign. He's reigning. He's reigning right now. But everything's not put under subjection, but he's reigning and just expecting until they are. This tells me that in his mind, in his idea of things, everything's going to be brought into subjection to him. Is that kind of what you read here? That's what I see in this. He must reign until all enemies are under his feet. Well, you might be saying to yourself, well, good for him, but what about me? Well, let's talk about you now. Let's look here. We've got some good passages about Jesus. Now he's seated at the right hand of God, and it doesn't sound like he's getting too exercised and disturbed about things. He evidently has a lot of confidence in God the Father and in what the finished work that he's done, that it's all going to come into alignment and it's going to get done. And he's just sitting there expecting until it all comes under his feet. And remember now what I started with. Paul wrote to the Romans and he said, God of peace will shortly bruise Satan under your feet. Now, look at Ephesians chapter 1 just for a moment. In case you're saying, well, that's good for Jesus, but what about me? Well, here Paul is talking about us as believers. And I want to back up before what I want to say and get the context. And here Paul prays a prayer for Christians. He's specifically writing to the church at Ephesus, beginning in verse 17, chapter 1, verse 17. Specifically, he's, of course, writing to the Ephesians. But you know what? The reason we read these epistles and take them seriously, take them to heart, is there's no difference between the Christians at Ephesus and the Christians at Alba. I mean, Christians are Christians.